Thank you for joining us tonight at The Weather at War. Before we begin, I'd like to inform you that we have a special treat, as this is a Frederick G. Corneal Memorial Lecture. Fred Corneal was a great friend to the Forum. He sat on our board and was an amazing supporter during his life. His wife, Marty Corneal, and his daughter, Katie Corneal Stromlin, are still on our board, and we're very lucky to have them. A couple of his interests included peace and environmentalism, so we thought that this would be an appropriate forum that he would have liked if he could have seen it. And I'd like his daughter, Katie Corneal Stromlin, to come up and just say a couple of things about Fred Corneal. Katie, come on up.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. On behalf of my family, I just would like to say how much we appreciate your remembering my father, Fred Corneal, with this memorial forum tonight. As Jennifer said, Fred was a longtime supporter of the Ford Hall Forum and believed strongly in the importance of free speech. On that note, I would like to thank our invited speakers tonight for also supporting free speech by coming here to enlighten us free of charge. That is a rarity in these times, and it is one of the things that makes the Ford Hall Forum such a unique and important institution. Thank you very much. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Katie, and we thank your family for being such great supporters for so long. I'd like to thank our forum's generous sponsors, including, among others, Altria, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the fantastic sponsors of our First Amendment Award reception, which I hope you're all coming to, and our partners here at Suffolk University who provide virtually unlimited in-kind gifts to the Ford Hall Forum. We also thank our esteemed members. Without you, none of this would be possible. I am pleased to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Ford Hall Forum board member Jack Wrobel. Jack Wrobel is a vice president at the consulting firm Shipley Associates, as well as a retired Air Force officer. He holds a BS in physics and an MS in space physics. Wrobel served as a selectman in Westford for 9 years and as a trustee of the J.V. Fletcher Library for 7 years. An advocate of lifelong learning, he has been a member of the Ford Hall Forum since 1991 and a member of the Ford Hall Forum board for the last 5 years. Please join me in welcoming Jack Wrobel.
Welcome to the Ford Hall Forum and our third event for this particular season. Tonight we're privileged to join into a conversation with three extremely eminent experts on why the climate is now seen as a national security threat and what we can do about it. Whether you think climate change is real or whether it's caused by human interactions, the impact of the climate is real. And tonight we'd like to talk about how that issue should be addressed. For example, much of the media talks about flooding and the impact of flooding, but really a bigger problem might be regional droughts. And the question is, what should the United States do to mitigate the risk of instability in such a case? While the military is only one part of the national security structure, we will be talking an awful lot about the military tonight, but don't let that limit your thoughts about national security and about the climate, because there are many other organizations that are involved in national security. For the first 45 minutes, we're going to be introducing the speakers. I'll ask each one of them to give a short opening remarks, and then we'll participate in a conversation among the panel. After that, we'll expand that conversation to you, the audience, and ask you to come up to the microphones. As Jenna said, there's 2 microphones, and ask questions of the panel. You can either ask a general question, or you can ask a specific one focused on one of the panelists. I would urge you to ask a question rather than give a speech. We do have limited time, and so if somebody decides to give a talk or something like that, I may have to ask them to get to the question, and I apologize for that in advance. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld. She's the CEO and president of the Truman National Security Project. The National Security Project recruits, trains, and positions a new generation of progressives across America to lead on national security. Previously, Dr. Kleinfeld was senior consultant at Booz Allen Hamilton, where she worked on energy security, terrorism, and homeland security issues. A Rhodes Scholar, she received her BA from Yale University and both her master's and PhD from Oxford University. Please welcome Dr. Kleinfeld.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here at Ford Hall Forum, and it's a thrill to be in Boston on such a beautiful day. I've had the pleasure of walking around your fine city all day today, and it is much nicer than Washington right now. The Truman National Security Project is interested in this issue from 3 different perspectives. We actually look at our energy posture. That's the way we think about it. And the energy posture affects national security because of our reliance on oil, climate change issues, and then the electricity grid. And so I want to address each of these in turn and also look at them from a big picture national security level as well as a tactical and military level. So from the big picture level, take oil. Oil has become, as many of you know, it is the backbone of our entire economy, our entire infrastructure. There is no price in this country that people pay more attention to than the price of oil as it goes up and down. But it's not just our country that pays attention to the price of oil. For every $5 increase in a barrel of oil, Russia gets $18 billion. Iran gets $8 billion, almost $8 billion, 7.8. And Venezuela, Chavez gets $5 billion. So if you think about how much oil has gone up in price recently, think about what that does to countries, whether we buy it from them or not. It doesn't matter who we're purchasing from. It's simply a global commodity price. But it's not simply that their oil price goes up and that then countries that are not necessarily aligned with our values are enriched. As former CIA Director Jim Woolsey says, the war on terror is the only war since the Civil War where we're funding both sides of the conflict. If you think about that, it's not only quite ironic, but very true, that we give Saudi Arabia about $160 billion a year for its oil. And of that $160 billion, about 3 or 4 billion, some small percentage, but not too small, makes its way into Wahhabist schools, which then in Pakistan and so on are training terrorists, training the ideology of terrorists. So it's directly funding that. We wouldn't dream of allowing a country like Saudi Arabia to set our foreign policy, but our dependence on oil actually gives them a say in it. It involves us in conflicts that we might not want to be involved in. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Republican governor in California, former Republican governor, just said, why should a dried up little country like Libya have a say and play havoc on American foreign policy? And it's a very good question. So oil, from a strategic level, is a big issue. It enriches countries that don't like us. The price itself does that. We also receive a lot of our oil from unstable countries. Of the top 5 producers that we receive oil from, those are all fairly stable, but we receive about 4 million barrels a day from countries that are on the unstable list of the State Department. So that's oil. Climate change is a separate issue. The CNA, the Center on Naval Analysis, convened a group of admirals and generals to look at climate change, about 13, you know many of their names, it's General Zinni and so on, and they studied the issue for quite a bit of time. And in the end, what they came up with was the idea that climate change basically acts as a threat multiplier. On its own, climate change does not cause a lot of the threats that we're facing, but it exacerbates them. So whether it's refugee movements in parts of the world that are facing climate issues, for instance, Bangladesh, which is right up against India, and India has built a fence to keep Bangladeshi refugees out of India. Well, if you imagine a flood going on or a severe weather event in that part of the world, and millions of Bangladeshi refugees running up against that fence and trying to get into India, and then think about what's India going to do about that. These are very impoverished countries. Bangladesh is an Islamic country. You have some real threat exacerbators. You also have issues along the Sahel border. So this is in Africa, where northern Africa, the Arab part of Africa, meets the part of Africa that's black Africa, that part. That line happens to be a climactic line. It's also a Christian-Muslim line. It's all sorts of things that happen along that line. And climate change is exacerbating movement of people, because as the climate is changing, you're seeing the crops change and the ability to have arable land change. And so suddenly you're seeing more conflict along that line in Africa. Well, it's no great surprise that the Horn of Africa and Nigeria and various countries where we're starting to see terrorist recruitment are on that same line, because you're getting distressed populations that are moving into areas that they hadn't been before, and more conflict. And our military then gets called on to deal with that kind of conflict. And for those reasons, the Pentagon included climate change in its quadrennial defense review as one of the issues that it's looking at. And the CIA has also stood up a climate change center to deal with it. The last issue is the electrical grid. If you look at our electricity grid, it's an incredibly brittle system. It's a 19th century system. An awful lot of it was built 100 years ago. I grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska. Our grid went out constantly. It was not a 19th century system. It just didn't function particularly well in Alaska. But around the country, we have a very brittle grid. It's brittle both in terms of blackouts and so on. It's also a problem because a lot of our grid is controlled by what's known as SCADA systems, which are open systems that are connected to the internet that open and close valves and so on. Well, the Pentagon believes that a lot of those systems have been infiltrated by China, possibly by other countries. They've been hacked, their cyber systems. You can hack them. It might not sound very scary that China could turn on and off your washing machine. And indeed, that's probably not particularly frightening. But all of our military bases are connected to that electrical grid as well. And the idea that China could turn on and off the electricity in our military bases at the same time they chose to, for instance, launch an attack on Taiwan or some such thing, that is a problem. And so you're seeing more and more bases trying to move off the grid. It's called islanding, trying to island themselves. So for those reasons, we as a national security organization are quite concerned with both climate and oil. The military, I don't want to take too much thunder from Hank, who's probably going to talk more about the military, but the military is interested in these issues on a tactical level. If you look at fuel moving onto the battlefield, the military used to measure that based on the wholesale price. But they finally started to measure the fully loaded cost of fuel, and the fully loaded cost of fuel measures how much does it cost to actually move that fuel, to buy it and then move it to the battlefield wherever they're using it. Well, it turns out that a gallon of oil costs about $400 to move to parts of Afghanistan. If you think about the oil efficiency of most of our battlefield equipment, which is not built, it's built for durability and strength, and it's not built for oil efficiency. These are not smart cars we're taking around Afghanistan. It's an incredible cost to the military. So if suddenly the military started saying, wait a minute, our cost is skyrocketing because of oil, and we really need to reduce simply on that measure alone. But they also started measuring the cost in human life, because in the battlefield in Iraq and in Afghanistan you're moving convoys through very narrow gaps in Pakistani mountains, and you basically have a lot of liquid bombs that are all lined up there, a lot of oil-laden trucks that are just waiting in a line to get through a small, I don't know how bad your traffic is here in Boston, but for us it's like being on the Beltway and you're just stuck. Well, those are prime insurgent targets. And the military was finding that for every 24 convoys that went out, we lost a human life. Those are not good odds. And so they're trying to limit oil on the battlefield and starting to look at how do they use renewables from a cost perspective and a life perspective. And with that, I think I'll wrap up my introductory remarks, and then we'll talk more about it as a group. So thank you very much.
Next, I'd like to introduce Carl Ferenbach. Carl has served as chairman of the board for the Environmental Defense Fund since 2008 and has been a board member since 2000. The Environmental Defense Fund is a leading national nonprofit that links science, economics, and law to create innovative, equitable, and cost-effective solutions to society's most challenging environmental problems. He is a co-founder and managing director of Berkshire Partners, and prior to that, he was a managing director of Merrill Lynch, where he headed the Mergers and Acquisition Department. Carl is currently a trustee of Princeton University and serves on the board of Dean's Advisors at the Harvard Business School. Please welcome Carl Ferenbach.
Thank you very much, Jack. Am I tipping that over? I guess I am. That's fine. Yeah, perfect. It's great to be here with all of you and following in Rachel's wake, which I'm always happy to do because she is she represents a generation of leadership that I think is just stunning. So it's 2011. This is the year when the global population has crossed 7 billion. Analysts note that 110 years ago, population, my grandparents were alive then, population was 1.8 billion. So it's increased fourfold. And in 1950, estimates of global affluence were $5.3 trillion. In 2011, estimates of global affluence are $55 trillion, a tenfold increase. Rob Sokolow, who's a scientist who's been lecturing on environmental issues for over 40 years, currently at Princeton, notes in a recent paper that science has introduced a big counterintuitive idea, that human beings are able to change the planet at global scale. Dutch chemist Paul Crutzen has coined the phrase Anthropocene to capture a growing view that this ability to change the planet could be epochal in geological terms. The Globe this Sunday, if you read it, you saw a front page story on rising sea levels. Big picture of houses in Scituate. Looked like the sea was rolling in. Estimates, according to the Globe article, are a possible increase in sea levels of 3 feet by the end of the century. I've seen other estimates which depend entirely on the rate at which the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica deteriorate, but that are much higher. Aya, that's a human name, he's a Sherpa who has ascended Everest 20 times since 1989, was recently reported as having organized an expedition to remove 11,000 pounds of debris from Everest. That's everything that we humans have left up there since we've been climbing it. He stated for this article that in his early climbs, the ascension to the summit was all ice and snow, and that today there are bare rock and open crevices, which he attributes to global climate, global warming. I'm not a member of the military. I did serve 47 years ago, and I don't know its policies. But I was privileged to host Ray Mabus, who's the current Secretary of the Navy, at a Environmental Defense Fund Chairman's dinner in New York. Secretary Mabus and his colleagues in the Navy are doing some amazing things. They are rapidly developing the greenest transportation fleet anywhere on the planet. They're experimenting with biofuels for their planes. Part of the way they are reducing emissions is, of course, using nuclear power in the fleet. The Marine Corps is also part of the Navy. Secretary Mabus told us about some of the things that Rachel alluded to, including transporting, having infantry units transporting their own solar capability onto sites in Afghanistan, generating their own power and not being dependent upon the truck fleets, which Rachel mentioned. The military, based on everything that we can see and what I just mentioned, has good cause to be concerned about the potential for disruption resulting from our ability to change the planet at global scale. In spite of all that, lest you think our inability as a political community to pass climate legislation means nothing is being done. Really, some quite remarkable things are being done from sectors which traditionally you would not have thought were going to be major contributors to the reduction in emissions. I'm referring to the corporate community. FedEx and UPS, for instance, now are increasing consist in their fleets of hybrid trucks. EDF helped FedEx develop the first hybrid trucks. UPS developed a simple construct of always taking right turns. They save an enormous amount of fuel by not taking left turns at intersections. Walmart, not long ago, the ultimate pariah, through supply chain management and other initiatives, expects to save emissions equal to taking 3.8 million automobiles off the road. Walmart of course, has a significant now sustainability staff. A number of NGOs have opened offices in Bentonville to be close to Walmart management. Walmart has put photovoltaic, it's a sort of a tape on the top of 20 stores now, and they're experimenting with that. GE has just announced that they're going to build the world's largest plant to produce that material here in the United States. At EDF, we have a 3-year-old program called Climate Corps. Climate Corps provides summer internships for MBAs who are between years. EDF provides 2 weeks of training. Fortune 1000 companies, this year I believe it's 52 Fortune 1000 companies are hiring a Climate Corps intern who will come in and with the support of the top office, work with the staff to identify opportunities to reduce emissions from the various processes that these companies engage in. One of my favorite numbers is Zipcar. Zipcar, you've all seen Zipcar around Boston. Zipcar is headquartered in Cambridge. Scott Griffiths, who's the CEO of Zipcar, said at a recent event that every Zipcar takes 20 private automobiles off the road. It has always struck me, since in recent years when this has been on my radar screen, it has struck me that energy is not a line item in a financial statement. Corporations don't directly measure the amount of energy they use. And as a consequence, haven't until very recently begun to think about their ability to reduce the amount of energy they use and still produce the same amount of output, increasing their productivity. But as these anecdotes indicate, almost everybody is beginning to take that on. These conversations need to happen in boardrooms if we're going to be successful. But can we be successful without legislation? Can we address the emissions from power generators, which are a significant portion of the emissions that are causing the greenhouse gas effect? It would be difficult. It will be difficult. So we will also need the Congress to engage if we are going to completely address this problem. Us, you and me, we can do our bit if we do energy audits on our homes and do the upgrades, which by most estimates produce very good rates of return. We can change out our appliances. We can drive efficient vehicles. We can buy offsets for our air travel. We can change our light bulbs. All those things are not actually insignificant, particularly if a population of 307 million people takes it on to do it. If we don't do these things, if the corporate community doesn't participate, if the Congress doesn't legislate, then the business as usual scenarios that the scientists project will definitely result in continued significant warming of the climate. And the disruptive outcomes are highly likely to occur as the planet warms, and our military needs to worry. Thank you.
Our third speaker is Harold Naughton, who is mostly known around here as the state representative from the 12th Worcester District. However, after the events of September 11th, 2001, at the age of 43, you don't look that old, Harold.
Thanks. I'll come back here more often.
He felt a need to further serve and protect his country, and he joined the United States Army Reserve. He volunteered for a tour of active duty and has served in both Kuwait and Iraq. He currently is a captain with the Judge Advocate General's Corps. He has also earned several combat medals, and he was recently selected to be the chair of the Joint Committee on Public Safety and Homeland Security. He is a graduate of Assumption College and holds a JD from Suffolk University Law School. Please welcome Harold Naughton.
Thank you, and it's really an honor and a pleasure. I'm going to think I sit here for most of the night and listen to you guys and learn a lot, and hopefully listen to you and learn a lot. This small town lawyer getting invited in such esteemed company, it's a real a pleasure and an honor, and thank you for all you've done, Rachel and Jack and Carl. I guess I'm kind of the generalist here a little bit. I wear a couple different hats. But let me start by saying this. In September of 1987, I sat where you're sitting on my first night of law school. I went to the night school at Suffolk University Law School right next door before they built the beautiful building over on Tremont Street. And then Dean and later on President David Sargent said, look to your left and look to your right. And in a month, one of those may not be here. Now, I don't know how true that became, and I certainly stayed, and most of my colleagues and friends did, and we found great success here at Suffolk Law School, and I'm very proud of my association. So I think I have a couple different hats on tonight, which I'd like to talk about. Obviously, the military connection, and but also a little bit I'd like to talk about the legislative connection, the local impact here of what we're talking about with climate change. But certainly has been alluded to several times about the effect of climate change on what the military needs to do. And I'll hasten to say that it will be doing the same, it will be doing different things, and it will be doing the same things differently. As we've seen with Hurricane Katrina, with numerous environmental events here in Massachusetts, such as the ice storm of late 2008 and the flooding that is becoming more and more recurrent along our coasts, our state National Guard, an element of the service, an element of the military, is being called upon to respond more and more often and are having to train for different missions, meaning expansions of budget and line items to allow them to do those missions. I will never forget on a deployment to Kuwait. I was in Kuwait at the time. I had not gone to Iraq yet. I was with a group of Louisiana National Guardsmen and Guardswomen, and Hurricane Katrina hit their coast. And they were really, really torn up because their local duty would have been out there saving their brothers and sisters back home, yet they were deployed in the deserts of Iraq and Kuwait. And it was very, very devastating to them because they went weeks and weeks without knowing what went on with some family members. So there was a tie-in there. Additionally, due to the lift capacity of the military, if climate change continues in the manner in which we have seen and which we continue to anticipate, the military will be called upon more and more to provide that lift capacity, as they are right now with 22,000 service members and 17,000 service members and 22 United States Navy ships off the coast of Japan helping in relief there. Now, I suppose we can't necessarily attribute what's happened in Japan to climate change, but imagine the future when events just as climactic can be attributed to climate change. And the only entity that will be able to be called upon is going to be our military and the military of other nations. And our militaries have been talking. The militaries of the United States and China and Brazil and other countries have been talking about these new missions that they will be called upon to perform. And the third mission, in my scenario here, will be the continued traditional mission of our military for offensive, and defensive efforts, but for different reasons. The potential of water and food security worldwide, but probably most especially in Africa, is tremendous. And the need that our military will be called upon to provide for that security, both domestically and internationally, is bound to grow. So our military is developing, is adapting as we go. Rim Parsons, in an excellent article published by the United States Army War College Strategic Studies Institute entitled "Taking Up Security Challenge of Climate Change," has pointed out that more than any other component of the government, the U.S. military, despite the demands of Iraq and Afghanistan, has the furthest reach and the greatest resources to create and sustain conditions favorable to peace and stability, and thereby promote sustainable development, ensure what is needed for adapting to and mitigating climate change, and its destabilizing effects is less kinetic, more peripatetic. That's not something the military historically has been used to dealing with. Sustainable security is something that both the military and our diplomats have been trying to develop on a much broader scale over the last few years, the 3 Ds: diplomacy, development, defense. As no time ever before in our past have the green suitors of the military and the blue suitors of the State Department and USAID tried to work together as much as possible. And I'll say, as an Army officer, when I was in Iraq, there was not always the most easygoing relationship between the military officers and those staff of state and USAID, but it's something we had to force ourselves, a new dynamic, to get over and to move on, because of the new missions called for on all sides, called for a greater understanding. State and USAID can learn from the military, can learn about the lift capacity, can learn about the historical missions of the military, and we can be taught by state about things such as the dynamics going on in China and the cooperation that will be needed as China steps up in its anticipated role as a member as a world power, as a superpower. The military's reach, capability, and durability in these circumstances are obvious, but not limitless. Again, it comes to dovetailing and exercising as much creativity as possible as we go forward, while still allowing the military to maintain its traditional role in the defense and protection of this country. I mentioned the National Guard. The committee I chair in the legislature, just up the hill from us, and I was running a little late tonight because we were in session debating some transportation legislation, is the National Guard is one of the entities my Committee of Public Safety and Homeland Security oversees. And the Massachusetts National Guard has been one of the leaders in our country in realizing this adaptive and developing role, both in their what's called their Title 32 status, is when they're in state, when they're doing their jobs here in Massachusetts, being that responding to disasters here, or when they're in what's called Title 10 status, when they're federalized and deployed overseas, as just about every single member of the 8,700 member Massachusetts National Guard has been over the last 10 years. But that being said, the need of the state to step up, of state legislators to take into account what is going on with climate change. It's kind of like the old axiom, act locally and think globally. But we have learned in these incredibly tight budgetary and fiscal times that we cannot count on the federal government for everything. And we have been forced, as Jack related about the article in the Globe on Sunday, about this decaying seawalls up and down the coast of our Commonwealth. Who's going to pay to fix those? The private property owners? The cities and towns? The Commonwealth? We had an incredibly disastrous ice storm in this Commonwealth in December of 2008. Like the likes of, I remember I was coming home from a late night session. I was driving up 495 towards my home in Clinton and looking off to the side and seeing these explosions. It reminded me of Baghdad at night. And it was transformers, electrical transformers, just exploding from the quick freeze, all up and down the side of the road. It was amazing. And that took weeks and months and millions of state dollars and some federal dollars to repair the cities and towns, the damage that our cities and towns sustained and suffered. Yesterday, for the first time, I'd like to think, in the history of this Commonwealth, 4 committees, my own Committee on Public Safety and Homeland Security, the Committee on Energy, the Committee on Natural Resources, and the Committee on Public Health convened a joint hearing in the Gardner Auditorium at the State House, bringing in the management of the Plymouth Nuclear Power Plant, the Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant, and of the Roe plant, the Yankee plant over the line that's been closed down in Vermont, to ask, what are they doing? What have they learned from what's gone on at Fukushima? And what can we anticipate to learn from that? And what protection are they taking? I was astounded to learn that the Plymouth plant negotiates with each single city and town in the EPZ, the Emergency Protection Zone, which is 10 miles. Does not have a common policy. They are not forced by MEMA or NRC to have a common policy of dealing with each of these cities and towns as far as reimbursement and mitigation for the training of the first responders in those cities and towns. And I do not intend this to disparage them. I don't know enough yet, but I'm certainly going to find out. But I can see the possibility that where they make a fantastic deal with Town A that has a very strong and advocate for a town administrator or a mayor or a board of selectmen. And the next town over has weak entities and doesn't make as good a deal. So it's the taxpayers on this local level that are potentially sucking up the response and the costs for any response to an emergency at that particular plant. And the EPZ only goes 10 miles out, and as we've seen and again, I know I'm getting a little from climate change here, but I think it's indicative of what the states and the cities and the towns face. If you're in Town C, which is 11 miles out, you will get no reimbursement for your emergency and first responder personnel. We need to develop on a state level a more uniform and common policy and a more broader-based policy to address issues like that. But these are the policies that are going to be the template for what we do as we approach on a state level climate change. States can lead the way. Massachusetts has led the way. The Massachusetts legislature has been in session since 1634. One of the oldest, if not the oldest, in the world. We don't necessarily sit back, and I'm not just kind of pat ourselves on the back here and wait for the federal government or other states to lead. We've led with the Clean Oceans Act in this state. We've led with the Green Communities Act and the Green Jobs Act over the last few years. Yes, we need our fellow states in New England and across the country to follow suit, but it's got to start someplace. And if it doesn't start someplace, then I guess you can turn to each other and say, look to your left, look to your right, and some of you may not be here if we don't tackle this problem sooner rather than later. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here in your company. Thank you.
Okay, you got the mics on? Good. All right. What I'd like to do now is to have the panelists participate in the conversation. I'd like to get that conversation started with asking Rachel about Operation Free and why the Truman National Security Project is championing.
Sure. Please come on. So, Operation Free was an effort that actually everyone here on the panel has something to do with. So it's a great question, Jack. Thank you. Truman started as a leadership development organization. We wanted to recruit, train, and position progressives on national security. And I was in a conversation with Carl talking about his passion, which was environment and climate, and saying, oh, well, you know, I used to work with the director of Central Intelligence, and we talk a lot about climate and all the issues that I mentioned to you earlier, and these are really important national security issues, and nobody's talking about them. And Carl said, oh, you need to talk with the head of EDF, because the Environmental Defense Fund is looking for ways to address this issue. And thereupon started this enormous year-and-a-half-long ride that we've been on at Truman. The Environmental Defense Fund at the time was trying to address climate change legislation that was going on Capitol Hill, and having a really rough time because it's become such a partisan issue. It's seen as the left cares about the environment and the right cares about cost, and it's become all mired in this ideological fight. And we from the security communities, this is ridiculous. The military has already realized that this is an issue. They're not fighting about it, they're dealing with it. They're putting a lot of R&D and a lot of knowledge into it, and actually they're gaining a lot of cost savings. The Army in Iraq realized that they were spending a huge amount on air conditioning, for instance, for troops, and so they developed some foam spray to insulate the tents out in Iraq, and turned out they put in about $95 million to insulate these tents so that the air conditioning could be more effective, and they saved $1 billion. So they're looking at it from cost, and it's just very practical. So we said, okay, we'll start gathering veterans to talk about these experiences and talk about why this is a security issue and why it's an economic issue and it's not partisan. And we promised to do it slowly because we hadn't done much advocacy. So we said we'll do 100 over the course of 9 months. We'll find 100 vets. Well, in 2 weeks, we found 150 vets. 2 weeks later, we were speaking in the White House. And then we were speaking to Congress, and all around the country, we did a 300-city bus tour. And one of the vets we found was Hank, who came out and said, I get this issue. I was in Iraq. And so I'll turn it over to you with how you got involved and why.
Oh, thank you. As I think any veteran, anyone who's been to Iraq or Afghanistan, or my dad's generation, he was a veteran of Normandy, will tell you, and I think I'm probably paraphrasing something that's been said many times, nobody hates war more than somebody who's been there. And it became, we all know what our national priorities are, have a pretty good idea about it. And we had stepped up at one point in our lives to, for every vet you talk to, every service member you talk to, and many in the audience here, will have their own various reasons. Mine were the fact that I had a great life at 9/11, and I had a nice, prosperous law practice. I had a great career in politics. I had a wonderful wife, and at the time 3 and now 4 beautiful children. And I walked up upstairs one night, a typical night, getting home late from the State House, and at the time, right about a month after 9/11, and saw my then 3 children sleeping, and said, "Boy, this is my treasure. Nothing else. The other success is nothing." And I said, in my mind, I had to step up and try to do a little bit more, and the rest you've heard a little bit about tonight. But once you've experienced that, it leads to other questions. It leads to questions about, can this be done differently? Can we prevent it? Can I prevent my own kids from having to go and do this? I remember a conversation I had with my dad. He passed away while I was in Iraq, but the night before I left, having a conversation with him, asking him to tell me about his war, the Great War, or the Greatest Generation, and his service as a medic on Normandy and through Europe. And he laughed, because he had never spoken about it like so many of that generation. He laughed and he said, come back in a year and in one piece, and we'll come back to this place that we were in, having some fellowship, and I'll tell you my story and you can tell me your story. And unfortunately, he passed away while I was gone, so we never had that conversation. And I guess part of it is that I don't know if I necessarily want to have that conversation with my own sons and my daughter. And can we do it better? Can we get to a point where we can internally change our national priorities so that we don't have to use the military, which is the ultimate instrument of foreign policy, to do what we've been doing? Or can we do it smarter? Or can we, such as Rachel was saying, 1 out of every 24 convoys that goes forward in Afghanistan loses someone. Well, can we do that better? And so when you come back and you think about things like that, and you run into people in different situations. At the time, I think I had just been appointed chair of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the House, and you meet people of like ideas and like goals, and the Truman Project really struck me as an instrument nationally, and even here on a local level, to be able to step forward and make those changes. It went right back to the very reasons why I decided to join the military after 9/11. Anyways, that was the protection of the blessings I had been given, not the material or financial blessings, but the names are Harrison, Tiernan, Claire, and Eamon, and my wife Ellen. It went back to that. And I said, this was another way to step up, get involved with the Truman Security Project and Operation Free. And can we change our reliance on oil? Can we change our reliance on traditional hydrocarbons, both for national security and for the future? And those were my reasons. And I met a lot of great people, a lot of very dedicated people who are as staunch warriors as anyone who put on a helmet and Kevlar and stepped out. And I don't care, they can insulate those tents all they want. It's still hot, okay? Especially when you're wearing 40 pounds of equipment. But Carl.
So that's it's a wonderful story to hear. The baser part of connecting Rachel with Steve Cochran, who runs the EDF climate program, was politics. At the time, legislation had passed the House, and the calculus in the Senate was difficult. The important Midwestern states, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all were represented in the Senate by Democratic senators who, in the ordinary course, were supporters of climate change legislation, but were representing states that were heavily dependent upon coal-fired power plants and on jobs that were heavily dependent upon ready access to fossil fuels, to operate the plants in which many people worked. And so we had the famous, Aunt Nellie from Terre Haute problem, was if we had cap and trade, which was the primary element of the proposed legislation, was that going to increase Aunt Nellie's monthly bill, and by how much? And could these very important senators support it? And recognizing that they might not be able to, the calculus was, how do we get enough Republicans to offset the loss of these senators and to get 60 votes for this legislation? And given that the military and our military involvement was more readily associated with the Republican Party than with the Democratic Party at the time, trying to find ways to reach those Republicans with military personnel who were committed to good environmental policy was the political driver.
Let me just ask another question of the panel. Recently, President Obama says that shifting the U.S. away from imported oil and towards cleaner energy farm will add jobs. He also said that we should tap our nation's greatest renewable resource, that's our ingenuity. I think, Carl, I'll toss this one to you. Isn't that what EDF is all about?
So, I'm sorry, Jack, say the question again.
Okay, again. President Obama said that we should tap our greatest renewable resource, ingenuity.
Right.
Okay, and when I read about EDF, it looked like EDF was all about that.
Well, indeed, I mean, the long-standing throwaway for EDF is finding the ways that work. The EDF is unusual in the environmental community in that it's deeply committed to markets. Markets are the most powerful mechanism for change that we as humans have invented, if the incentives are right, if they are not coming at the expense of the commons, and if their activities are not, and so if they have proper political oversight. And so finding ways to engage markets in solving problems, and therefore providing incentives for people to solve problems, has been a principal approach to EDF's solutions to various various undertakings. So we have a classic one we're working on now. The Colorado River provides water for 30 million people. 29.5 million of those people, roughly, give or take, live in cities and suburbs, and 500,000 of them operate 4 million acres of farmland. Guess how the water is split? Right, 80% to the farmland. So it's use it or lose it if you're a farmer with a water right. So as a consequence, they grow crops that are low-value crops. And in the meantime, the demand for water out of the Colorado River has now crossed the supply. If you go to Lake Mead, you see this great white line all the way around Lake Mead, and it's about to go below the principal pipe that provides water into the city of Las Vegas. Las Vegas is drilling a new pipe further down in Lake Mead. So, you know, can you mandate change, or can you provide market incentives that will persuade farmers to use their water as a product and not grow low-value crops, and persuade cities to properly value water, plug leaks, not let water get away. And the best mechanism that we're able to come up with as we think about it is the pricing mechanism. If people understand the real value of water, recognizing that for many it's just a basic fundamental human need and right, and therefore you can't price it at a level at which low-income people cannot afford it. The recognizing that, you can create different tiers of pricing in the marketplace and hopefully use the market to solve the problem. There are lots of stories where markets have worked, and that's the ingenuity that we hope President Obama was referring to.
Harold or Rachel, do you have any other comments on that?
Well, if you could, I'd like you to come help us here in the Commonwealth. I think we've tried to do good things for our economy, utilizing our homegrown ingenuity, because Massachusetts is not a state rich in resources, except for our educational institutions and our people and our natural beauty. And we've tried to, through economic incentives and tax breaks over the last, well, the time I've been in the legislature, to entice companies and new growth industries into the Commonwealth, to replace our traditional manufacturing industries that have all but fled south, or very far south, or far east, and the financial services industry, which has grown up, but we wanted to diversify from there. And we thought we were doing well for a while, until a little company named Evergreen decided they wanted to take the tax breaks that and incentives that had been given them, and and say thank you but no thank you. And that was pretty depressing when they decided to go to China. They will be leaving some bases here, but who's kidding who? They're going to China. Carl, I won't put you back on the spot here, but any thoughts you have on that, please get them to me, and I'll float them in the legislature. I'll look like a hero.
I think that the governor has a very, this is more in the range of emissions, but the governor has a very plausible, well thought out plan on emissions reduction that includes investment, new investment in renewable energy, in both solar and wind power, as well as incentives for savings in the private sector. And I think, I've heard it presented. I thought it was very well thought out, and I hope the legislature can support it.
We'll see what we can do.
Yeah.
I'll just take a somewhat more international look at this, but if you look at who's really investing in this and who's using their ingenuity, it's China. China is putting millions and millions of dollars into R&D for green energy because they see it as not just helping themselves because they have a huge energy need, but as the next big thing. They have a lot of people to employ. If they don't employ about 1 billion people a year, their system of government, which is, of course, autocratic, won't sustain itself. And so they're really looking for the next big employment mechanism, and they see green energy as one of the ways to do that. In America, while we are huge in the photovoltaic market and so on, we're developing with ingenuity some really smart technologies, things like it's almost like a paint. It's called thin film, that you can take solar, the solar mechanism, and spread it extremely thinly, much more cheaply. Really interesting technologies, but we're not putting any R&D money in. The amount that we're putting in compared to other countries is minuscule, and the return on the investment for this, it's not just windmills or very fancy things. It's also just very normal blue-collar jobs. It's things like HVAC retrofitting. Can you rebuild your air conditioning system so that the air conditioning is cheaper and more efficient? That kind of thing makes a huge difference. It's regular jobs. It's jobs for people who don't need to be retrained, but we're not investing in it. And part of that has a lot to do with Congress right now, and Congress looking penny-wise and pound-foolish, basically, trying to save little bits of money but not investing long-term in jobs. But it's not only the markets here. It's really interesting what you were saying about the markets. I just finished writing a monograph with one of our Army vets, who's another Operation Free veteran, about distributed generation in the developing world, because the developing world doesn't have a lot of central electricity. A lot of their electrical grids are broken. But what a lot of business people are realizing is that it's a huge opportunity to sell to the developing world. You have billions of people, some of whom, even if they're only making $20 a day, have some disposable income. I used to work in development. Any slum you go to in India or Nepal, people have television sets, they have refrigerators, they're buying things. They just don't have a huge amount of money. And so the ability for America to use our ingenuity to sell at home, it also has markets abroad that we could be tapping if we were being more smart about the kinds of things we're developing and putting in some of the R&D, because there's a multi-billion-dollar market. McKinsey estimates it at over $200 billion as a market for distributed generation in the developing world, and it's ours to take or lose.
Okay, at this point, I'd like to turn to one of the long-standing traditions with the Ford Hall Forum and kind of expand the conversation now to you, to the audience. So I would ask you to come up to either one of the microphones and ask either a general question to the panel or ask a specific question. And while the people are coming up to the microphones, let me just throw one question out myself, and that is, there was a RAND report that came out in January that basically threw cold water on a lot of what you've been saying. And it said the military could not benefit from alternative fuels R&D. It said that the life cycle of cost of plant-based alternative fuels was not known, so therefore the military should actually reduce its R&D. What do you guys think about that?
Well, one of the economic issues associated with this whole question is, are we willing to price the externalities? So if carbon is an output of energy processes of all types, and it has consequences, and we're putting it up in the atmosphere at prodigious rates. It lives up there for a couple of hundred years. It acidifies the oceans. It kills off life forms in the oceans. It has significant costs and will have greater cost to us here. And we don't price that into the cost of energy. So as a consequence of not doing that, what we do is the reverse. We subsidize the higher cost forms of energy, such as solar and wind power, from government funds. So we pay for it anyway. We just pay for it in taxes rather than pay for it at the pump. So the question that we will have to come to grips with as a social political body is, are we willing to add in the true cost of the energy that we consume, the fossil fuel energy that we consume, and balance that off against the somewhat higher cost of renewable energy sources. Now, I suspect that I don't know what the RAND study did, and knowing RAND, I'm sure they considered elements of this, but anyway.
Harold?
I'll almost answer more with a question. I mean, aren't they setting up almost a false dichotomy? The military is, by a large measure, the biggest user of petroleum in the country, if not the world, and therefore the largest footprint, carbon footprint. Yeah. They need to do it anyways, whether or not we're having this discussion here today or not, just for their the military's own sustainability long term. So I disagree with this their point that they should back off on the R&D. It needs to be done anyways.
Okay.
Yeah, I quite agree. I also think that there's externalities in terms of human life that we've been talking about, as well as in terms of cost, that the RAND study didn't take into account. It also isn't taking account differences in price that occur when the military, which the U.S. military is the biggest user in the entire world of energy. If it was a country, it would rank 38th for oil consumption of any country. It's got a huge footprint. It's also a price mover. So when the Navy, for instance, purchased 150,000 liters of camelina oil, which is a plant that grows oil like canola oil, kind of for their biofuels, that purchase brought the price of the oil down by 50%. So they're moving the prices as well as purchasing. There's also funny accounting, and this is very Washington inside baseball, but there's funny accounting that goes on with the Office of Management and Budget. For that purchase, for instance, OMB said, well, you're purchasing this amount of oil over 10 years, so you have to pay for it all in the first year because you're buying it in year one. And they said, well, but we'll use it over 10 years, so can't we spread the cost over 10 years, because that's how we would purchase it if it was oil. They don't buy futures contracts on oil, as far as I understand. And OMB said, no, you have to pay in the first year because you've made a promise and now it's a liability. So you get that kind of funny accounting going on, which has a lot to do with the moment you purchase and the price of oil versus the price of camelina, and not taking into account how it comes down over time, things like that.
Yep, a couple of people at the microphone. Sir, would you?
Hi. It was asserted that the cost of the fuel convoys in Afghanistan are measured not just in dollars, but in human lives. But of course, that's not entirely true. The only lives that we measure are our own American or so-called coalition force lives. As Tommy Frank says, we don't do body counts. So obviously, the cost in lives is a false accounting. What good is it going to do to have more benign environmental policies if they're coupled to such malign foreign policies that result in these criminal war of aggression in these countless uncounted victims of these policies?
So I'm happy to answer that. One of the worst things that U.S. foreign policy does is rely on oil. If you look at oil states that get have a significant percentage of their revenue from oil, they are across the board the worst states, the most corrupt states, the states that treat their people the worst. And there's a reason for that. Across the board, when a country gets its money from oil, it's called a rentier state. They're getting rents from oil. They don't need to pay tax. They don't need to collect taxes from their people. And so they don't treat their people very well, and they end up very corrupt. As long as the United States is tied to oil as our main strategic source of fuel, we're backing these states. We're allied with Saudi Arabia. We're allied with a lot of countries that we should not be allied with and don't want to be and wouldn't be in any other course of events except for our dependence on oil. Angola is our sixth biggest, we import from 5 countries, and then Angola is the 6th that we import from. Angola is one of the poorest, most corrupt countries on earth, and it's because of the oil. And we're supporting that through our foreign policy. So it's not just the wars. That's easy to point to because that's an act of, we're doing it actively. But the dependence on oil is causing these kinds of problems in our foreign policy, and it absolutely has to stop. It's against our values,
Right.
not only putting our soldiers' lives in danger.
It's not only the oil-producing states that we've supported, it's also Israel, which is not an oil-producing state, and Afghanistan, which also may be a corridor, but hasn't yet been proven to be an oil-producing state either. So it is foreign policy in large measure.
Okay. All right. Please come on up. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your knowledge and sharing it with us. I'm a mechanical engineer. I worked at Pilgrim Station. And I was very disturbed by the statement that you made that our electrical systems are over 100 years old. It's part of our infrastructures. So how can we, as a developed economy and developed country in the world, can actually let something like that happen and not be concerned that we cannot sustain, you know, the demand for new technology that uses electricity? That on a way we are so rudimentary prepared to deal with all these issues, and then we can, you know, make adjustments for new fuels, for alternative energy, for alternative sources. So everything has to come together, and when we have, you know, intelligent leaders that are actually talking into that, it makes me very proud to see that he's actually concerned about it. Pilgrim is 40 years old, so are a lot of other stations. What are we doing for the future? Because we are all using our, you know, little machines that we depend on, but how are we powering the towers that are providing, you know, power for the little devices? So we need to think a little backwards in order to move forward. Thank you.
Anyone want to comment on that?
You know, briefly, and you know, I know I'm more of the generalist here tonight. I appreciate your comments, especially knowing Pilgrim as you do. And if anything, that Fukushima has brought to light that we didn't learn from TMI or we didn't learn from Chernobyl, it is the shelf life, not the half-life, but the shelf life of these plants. And where do we go next? Do we become France and expand? I think not. I think that the opportunity to, although incredibly costly, to fix our infrastructure, of our grid infrastructure, which, Rachel, how much does it lose before it even comes to our house or to our building? 20, 30%, you know, just goes off into nowhere. The opportunity to fix that, though incredibly costly, could be programs, say, like the space program. That could also be an economic driver for our country, where smart guys like Carl can figure out a market to find the financing for that, and the financing will create jobs, and the jobs will create sustenance, and the sustenance will create good things for our country.
At your level, you can actually influence big companies like Westinghouse and General Electric. They are basically the manufacturers of the two types of reactors that are used in the nuclear energy for the domestic use. So instead of course, it's nice that they are developing paints and all kinds of new things, but how are you going to upgrade or create a new generation of reactors? And what indeed has been learned? The reactors in Fukushima are exactly like the reactor at Pilgrim. It's a boiled water reactor. It's a very simple technology. It's no comparison to Chernobyl. That was a very nightmare kind of a design. But this is something very simple. But, you know, we need to recognize as we get old, the power plant gets old. So all the equipment in there gets old. Certain things can be salvageable. But like in a house that we live in, we know that the pipes get old and, you know, the wires need to be changed and so forth. It's the same thing. It's something alive. And I am stunned that nothing has been done in over 100 years to upgrade our power supply.
I think it's not quite as draconian as that, but there are new generations of technology. It takes a decade or more to permit a new nuclear facility. and then to get it built. And we could easily reduce that, but would it be in the public interest to do so? These are the new generations of technology are believed to be considerably safer. They're more efficient, what have you. In addition, there's a lot of interesting work being done in an area called the smart grid. I think of it in two pieces. The power industry would think of it in one, but the smart grid is deploying technology that we live with in the ordinary course into the grid in such a way that it allows the power generators to manage and measure their production far more efficiently and to price it into the marketplace in ways that reflect usage patterns. So, for instance, if your power generator today charges you the same, ours in Vermont charges us 13 cents a kilowatt hour. Basically, whether we turned on the lights at 4 in the morning or whether we got them on at rush hour or got them on at 6 o'clock at night when everybody's listening to Vermont Public Radio. So why should that be the case? If the power company told me that we had to pay 20 cents a kilowatt hour at 6 o'clock at night, but at 10 o'clock we got to pay 6 cents a kilowatt hour, we'd think about doing a lot of things at 10 o'clock that we now just do randomly at any time during the day. So the smart grid will have an impact on human behavior, and then there will be devices that we can have on our kitchen counters that will allow us to measure our own usage, and our children and grandchildren will tell us that we're using it inefficiently the minute we put the numbers in front of them. And so there are plenty of technologies out there now that will change behavior and improve production. We still have to come to grips with the fact that what we have on the drawing board is primarily coal-fired power generation.
Yes, sir.
Yes. It's interesting. We're talking about climate control, and there's a very large segment talking about the military. And now I'm going to just make a comment, and I want to comment from the panel. I just feel that we spend far too much money on the military. I think we use it seems that we have rockets available to shoot down mice. We have planes that are very expensive to produce, that consume tremendous amount of gas, of fuel, and so forth, and also, of course, all the other things with the military that we use. And we have a fear that, you're commenting about China having, spying on us and so forth. Well, China, the people in China, the Chinese government may be authoritarian, but they are not stupid people. They would never attack us because it wouldn't be in their interest to attack us. And so therefore, my feeling is that we should substantially cut the military budget. I mean, not only would it help on the deficit, but I don't think that an awful lot of the things we have in the military are necessary.
I'll just comment on one portion of your statement, sir. I think a blanket statement that the Chinese people are not stupid, so they would not attack us. Well, no, they're not stupid, and probably under their current government would not attack us, especially with $3 trillion of our money in their banks that they don't want to ruin. But you also have to anticipate the future. I mean, things change quickly in today's world, and that government could change. Their attitudes could change. And they could be, for the very reasons we're here tonight, talking about the potential instability in world markets, in water security, in food security. That could put us at danger. I'm not saying I necessarily disagree with the sentiment of your overall statement, but to take, I would respectfully, sir, I would suggest that is a relatively short-sighted statement, just that part of it.
They've had tougher governments before. I mean, they're a lot more moderate now than they were during Mao's period of time. They were rattling the cage. They wanted to
They have about 600 million more people now than they had during Mao's time.
They have just as many, I think they had just about as many people during Mao's time. Their population has not grown that much, but I know it's about 1.3 billion people, but they're just, and there's better relationships between the United States and China now than there were 40, 50 years ago, when they were really concerned. They wanted Taiwan, and they didn't do it. And certainly if they didn't attack Taiwan, I mean, they got a long ocean to go across to attack our country. So I don't see where they would it be in their best interest. And as you said, we owe them $3 trillion. Why the heck would they want to destroy that? And they've also built a tremendous infrastructure, and they're a developing economy. Why would they want to destroy it with a war?
So I think just two quick comments here. One, on the bigger picture of the budget. I think everybody knows right now that Washington, D.C. is having a ridiculous argument over the budget. It is one of the stupidest arguments that I've ever seen Washington, D.C. have, and they've had a lot of stupid arguments
I would agree
since I first got there. They're talking about basically a third of the budget. They're threatening to shut down our government based on this fight about a third of the budget. Well, an awful lot of the budget that they're not talking about is defense, and an awful lot is entitlements, Social Security and Medicaid. You cannot have a rational budget conversation without talking about defense and without talking about entitlements. So we should start from there. Right now we're having a very childish conversation that's going on. I think that there are threats in the world. There are threats to the United States. There are also threats to other countries. My own background is in human rights and development, and our military does a huge amount for other countries with our naval ships that go out and do humanitarian missions, and even things, whether you agree or not, like the humanitarian activities that we're doing to protect civilians in various other countries. So I think we need a military. Does it need to be as big as it is right now? No. We should probably have a single national security budget so that we're looking at our defense, our development aid, our diplomacy as all one piece. And that needs to be rebalanced, because if you look at the 21st century, I remember I was doing interviews with Donald Rumsfeld's Office of the Secretary of Defense when Rumsfeld was in charge, and it was not long after 9/11, and I was asking him about homeland security issues. And the person who will go nameless was basically saying, no, I don't want to talk about homeland security. That's defense. We need to be on offense. And I said, well, yes, we need to be on offense, but let's talk a little bit about defense. What are you doing on homeland security? And no, you don't get it. We need to be on offense. It's all about offense. And I said, well, I'm not a great sports player, but every sports team I've been on has had an offense and a defense. So let's talk about defense. I was working for the Defense Science Board. We needed to do a study of this. And he went on, and finally I got quite angry. And I said, look, there are terrorists in London. Are we going to bomb London? And he said, yes. End of conversation. We're not bombing London, I hope. And there's a lot of problems that are real threats. They're real threats to human life in America and in other countries, but we can't solve them militarily. So we need a more balanced budget. But you also have to look at the nature of warfare now. A lot of warfare now is cyber warfare rather than China pointing guns at us. So I'm not actually particularly worried about China pointing guns right now. Although having been there in January, I am pretty worried about the nationalism of their people. They've been feeding a lot of nationalism to their people for a long time, and you could have a Japan-like situation if you had a collapse there, where a new, more nationalistic generation comes in and you get a situation like we had with Japan in World War II. That's a far-off worry, but it's not an impossible worry. The nearer-term worry is that it's very hard to track down cyber attack. And that is already happening. It's already pretty clear that China has attacked our Congress. When the Congress welcomed the Dalai Lama, they attacked our Congress. They've already hacked the Pentagon quite a bit. So you get those kind of attacks. They're hard to trace. You can't call them war. We're not going to go to war with China over hacking our computers. But our whole military is based on computers right now. So you get these kinds of issues that are much more complicated and difficult.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you.
Let's go to another question, please. Yes, sir.
Yeah, talking about possible worries plays into my question. I'm an atmospheric scientist by training, and in one of my previous incarnations, about 20 years ago, I used to talk to high school and middle school classes about climate change. And one of the things I used to tell them that they might not have thought about was that at that time, the US and the Soviet Union had submarines all underneath the ice caps and everything. And if the ice caps went away, how would that change, geopolitics and how defense works? And we heard earlier tonight that it's now a more likely scenario is food and water and natural disaster, refugees and things like that. But basically we're talking about perils, risks, and insurance. And I've always thought that whether we spend money on reducing emissions or mitigating things is really, you're really saying, are we going to buy insurance against a possible risk? And you've all talked about that a little bit as we've gone. And so I was really intrigued when I was reading the material for this talk about the idea, I hadn't really thought about it before, that the military is driving this. Maybe 10, 20 years ago, I first started hearing that one of the groups taking climate change seriously was actually the insurance industry, because if worst case scenarios played out, they would be the one whose stockholders would be affected, or earnings. And now it's encouraging to hear that that's spreading a little bit, but it's really interesting to me, intriguing to hear that the military, as if you want to think of them as a business or an entity, could now be a driving force to try and change the minds of the 60 senators, or maybe just the 6 senators that you need. And so my question is, especially now that it sounds like you've all been in the trenches a little bit over the last year or two, is just how realistic is it, given the present political situation that you described, how realistic is it that over, say, the next 5 to 10 years, the military actually could be a driving force in changing the opinions of the average taxpayer and also the average representative or senator to take the risk of climate change seriously, along with all the other risks that exist, and treat it as a risk that you might want to buy some insurance against?
Distinguish, if I may, I'll be brief because I think these guys have more to offer. Distinguish the military as a driver from veterans from a driver. The Truman National Security Project Operation Free is made up primarily of veterans and some tremendously accomplished generals and admirals, and that they, as opinion leaders, cannot be underestimated. I myself is still a currently serving reserve officer, even though I'm here as Representative Naughton, still have to, as with my discussion with the gentleman there, have to really temper a lot of what I say, and so don't currently serving officers like Admiral Mullen and General Casey and General Petraeus, and we've seen in the past year when some senior officers don't temper what they say, or that they're not senior officers for much longer. But the military has always stepped up. Historically, the officer corps has stepped up to try to point out to the civilian leadership the threats that are coming in the future to our country. In the 30s, they were probably having discussions pointing out the threats of Nazi Germany and militaristic Japan. And through maybe some people want to think that they were listened to in the Cold War too much, but that has always been the job of senior officers and senior members of the military to try to advise, not to lead, but to advise. And I think there was a demonstration of the history of that on, when was the Afghan surge speech at West Point? December 1st of 2009, when it was pointed out by many of the commentators that historically at times of military crisis in our country, presidents have gone back to that seat of military learning, West Point, to give speeches such as that. So how realistic is it that the veterans and the senior officers will be listened to? I hope it's very realistic. But as we've seen going on in Washington, as Rachel has articulately said, there's a lot of silly stuff going on in Washington, and there's only so much currently serving military officers can do to kind of make the civilian leadership, listen. They can. It's like a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. I can advise my clients. I can lay the options on the table. And oftentimes clients will say to me, well, what should I do? I said, well, I cannot tell you what to do. These are your options.
I guess my question would include groups like the CIA and just groups that aren't NRDC or even
right.
So we've been blessed to work with groups like NRDC and EDF. I think Hank's point is very well taken. The military itself and serving military, they're going to drive this change through procurement. By buying things, they're going to drive costs down, and that'll make things more affordable to everyone else. And then the companies will be able to afford it and will make decisions based on the market. So that's what the military as a sitting entity can do, and through R&D. The veterans community can be tremendously effective, and we've seen this over and over and over again with Operation Free. It's been just amazing. We'll take a group of veterans up to Capitol Hill, and we had one member who had a 10-minute meeting with us. That's pretty typical for Capitol Hill. You sit with the senator for 10 minutes, and they do a photo op, and they're very happy, and then you're supposed to move on. And this particular senator started talking with us, and his handler came in and said, "Sir, you've got another meeting. You've got to go." No. Sir, knocked back in 20 minutes later. "You've got another meeting. It's time to go." And an hour later, he was still talking to the vets. That's the kind of connection that you can make with very conservative members of Congress that I've never seen with anything else. We're also trying to do it with other constituencies that can then affect members of Congress. So we went to NASCAR in Kansas City and had our vets at NASCAR. We sponsored a car.
Why didn't I get invited on that particular trip?
I didn't go either. I gave up my seat to somebody who cared a lot about NASCAR. But we sponsored a car, and the driver got lots of coverage, and then we had a bunch of our vets handing out camo T-shirts with solar panels on the back and windmills and so on, and beer koozies that also had solar panels and so on. We had 30,000 people stop by our tent, NASCAR fans. Of the 30,000 NASCAR fans, only 2 objected to the message about climate change. Now, this is not your typical environmental audience, and these are people located in the states that we need to influence their senators and their members. But when a bunch of veterans who've been into Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam and so on say, "Hey, I was there, this is what I saw, this is the message," it takes it out of the realm of the partisanship that they're used to. And then those people, 3,000 of those 30,000, signed up. They said, "We want to be involved." Well, from an organizing standpoint, a political standpoint, that is a terrific return on investment. And we'll be putting them to work, and all of a sudden you'll have a NASCAR constituency aligned with the veterans constituency who will be trying to change the political calculus. And once that frame changes, once it's seen as patriotic to turn off the lights, to get a new fridge, to do these things that are just common sense, once it's seen as patriotic, and then once it's seen as a good pocketbook issue, then the government changes. Our leaders tend to lead from about 20% behind. 80% of the people have to go in front before they can lead. That's American politics, and so we need to get those 80%, but I think we can do it.
You have a question over here?
Yes. Comment and a question. There's a book out by the name of...
Can you get closer to the microphone,
yes.
please?
Comment and a quick question. There's a book out called Weather Warfare by a gentleman by the name of Jerry Smith, and it's called How the Military Has a Plan to Draft Mother Nature. And in it, the book talks about how the military has developed technology to induce tsunamis, earthquakes, so on and so forth. My question is, do you think that the military over the past X amount of years has contributed to global warming and climate change by their clandestine operations as far as seeding the clouds to make them rain and the Project HARP?
I think that, I guess you never want to say never to anything, but I think that science is following this question and all of the data that we collected that is associated with it so closely that if anything like that had happened, it would be known and it would be a major public issue. So I think it's highly unlikely. But the question of geoengineering, could we cool the planet? As Sokolow said, we have it within our capacities to change the planet. We have it within our capacities to cool the planet. We have no clue what the consequence of our deployment of a plan to cool the planet might ultimately be, and that's a problem. But we have the technology to do it. So it's a legitimate concern. I just seriously doubt it could have happened without our knowing about it.
Okay, we have two more people. Huh? You want to cut it now? Two more people. Okay. I'm taking directions from our executive director. Go ahead, one question.
Great.
Sir, you'll have the last question.
On a similar but hopefully less scary note, it's been said, I think this year, that they made it rain in Dubai. Is that something that we think we might be able to deploy in something like Lake Mead to help some of our own water issues?
I'm sorry, I missed, we did what was?
It rained naturally in Dubai.
Oh, it rained in Dubai.
And I guess the suggestion was that was from a cloud seeding or something, but
yeah.
Can we use these things for good rather than scary?
The water in the Colorado River Basin comes primarily from the snowpack in the Rockies. And so could we get it to snow more in the Rockies? Personally, I'd be a fan because I ski there about 35 days a year. But I haven't heard anyone come up with that idea yet. We get, fortunately, still get a fair degree of normal moisture. That the projections are for what they're worth, and I have no idea whether the science is any good, but that the Southwest will suffer more. Most arid parts of the country will suffer more from global warming than, for instance, New England will.
Yes, sir.
My question has to do with ethanol and the what I think of as the balkanization of the U.S., where, as I understand it, ethanol is fairly inefficient, it's expensive, it takes more energy to produce it than it produces, yet we provide tax incentives for it, and it's obviously different sections in the country promoting their local interests rather than national interests. And I'd sort of be interested in your views on when is the country going to come together and act in a more homogeneous way for the greater good, and could you comment on that, please?
Sure. So we tend as a country to subsidize various technologies and pick winners and then act surprised when this continues because we've created interest groups that last. So all of our Depression era subsidies, we have subsidies on peanuts and cotton and all sorts of crops that were put in place during the Depression. They're all still around. None of them have gone away. They now have huge effects on Africa. So we did the same with ethanol. We've put in various subsidies and so on to help the farmers, and those farmers are in important states because of the way that our government system works to give small states a lot of power. Coming from Alaska, I sometimes appreciated that, but it's not always the best way to run a country. So ethanol has an entrenched political interest, and it's hard to break. And from a practical matter, it's not a good technology. There are ways to produce fuel from biomass that are decent technologies. So switchgrass, for instance, various kinds of, it's called cellulosic material, perfectly fine. And you can get some pretty good bang for your buck without the externalities that come from feedstock-based ethanol, beets, and corn. Different countries can make it with different levels of efficiency. Brazil's more efficient than we are. They make a lot of their energy from sugar. But for us, not so efficient. It was a decent political bargain that was made at a certain time that has now outlasted its usefulness. The reality from a political standpoint is that if we move forward on some of this, it's going to be an everybody gets a little bit kind of a situation, because the perfect can't be the enemy of the good here. And so the only way that you're going to get some of those senators and members of Congress to come along is to continue some of these subsidies even though they're not good. And that's just political reality. And then you're going to have to make some giveaways to other places. Alaska might get a little bit more oil or some offshore drilling. One of the things that killed the climate bill was paradoxically the BP spill. You would think that the BP spill, the oil spill, would have helped the climate bill because it would have shown how bad oil was and offshore drilling and shouldn't we move to something else. But in fact, that was supposed to be a giveaway. The left wanted to give the right some offshore drilling so that the right could then give the left some cap and trade. Well, after the BP spill, we couldn't give away offshore drilling because it was politically untouchable, and so you lost your ability to trade. That's the situation we're going to end up with ethanol, and it's not great, and a lot of sausage making is not pretty, but it'll move us a little closer to the goal.
And over to Jim.
I'm like the Grim Reaper of the forum sometimes. I just show up and you can see on everyone's face, oh, it's over. How about a big hand for our speakers and our moderators? Another fantastic conversation. Thanks for coming out. If you're not already a member of the forum, become one. Thanks so much. Have a great night.